All right, so yesterday we went to the march in downtown Dalton. It was peaceful, peaceful protest. We are pro First Amendment people. Uh,
Yeah, even when you might disagree with people,
Yeah,
right? You have
yeah.
different points of view. You got to defend everybody's right to
That's right.
have their voice heard.
Yeah, there was a group in Philadelphia that did that one time. It happened like right around 1776. A bunch of different opinions that went into a room, and they came out with this little document. You know, uh,
But yeah, I mean, we're in the middle of quite the ordeal here nationally. Uh, just coming on I say the heels of a global pandemic, but I don't know did that end yet or
yeah. No
or
one was
what,
worried about all these rioters and looters wearing masks, were they? They were just like, yeah, do that. Oh yeah, hey, put a mask on too, please.
but it's got heated. It's
Yeah.
got tense out there real quick. Passions are being they're definitely ramped up and perhaps they'll being inflamed further, which is our concern and a concern to be observed. But in the beginning or the instigating event here, George Floyd being killed by a police officer on video for the world to see, has rightly got lots and lots. It would rightly ought to have every human being both deeply saddened and angered with a righteous indignation that ought to lead you to want justice, have a great desire for justice, which speaks volumes, I think, about to what we hope to talk about today.
Yeah, and just to carry that on further, justice was carried out. He was prosecuted, which he ought to be, and he is locked up, which he ought to be, right? And I don't think that we're gonna dive into this more. I think just to say this up front, like I believe that most Americans were on that side. Like, where were the Americans going? Set him free. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't. I didn't see any of those videos, right? I didn't see any of that on social media. That was like set him free. No, everybody universally condemned the actions of the officer that took George Floyd's life. All of us. No one is on the side of the officer that I can. There might be 3% of the population that are just absolutely white supremacists, racist, whatever. But universally, we condemn that behavior, and we ought to condemn that behavior. White, black, yellow, green, purple, blue, it don't matter. Like that's not what law enforcement is called to do. They're called to protect and to serve the citizens.
Yeah, and including, I bet there were a lot of law enforcement officers all across the country, the world, who saw that and were disgusted.
Absolutely.
And were burdened to the core because, such a person would give them, their profession, their brothers and sisters in that, a bad name and put them in danger.
Sure.
And put them at odds with the people that they see themselves desiring to protect day in and day out. And this person doing the exact opposite of what their mission and charge is as law enforcement officers. But one thought just based on what you had said a minute ago, in our desire for justice, and you said that we saw that, and in a sense we did through the arrest of the officer. But I just to make a point that our longing for justice can't be satisfied here.
That's right.
In this life.
That's right.
Because I know people see the officer and then they be arrested and it's like, well, it's not enough. And I want to see him. I want to see him hanged, or I want to see him put to death to avenge George Floyd. But even then, will you be satisfied? Because then you could point to these other instances of racial injustice, and you could point to the greater issues at hand, and they're still ongoing. And so justice is not truly or finally been established, but it's a picture of what humanity can do in punishing the unjust and calling them to account. But as Bible believing Christians, and that's, we'll come at this issue from that perspective on a number of different points today. But the final judgment and our desire, longing for justice, can only be brought about by God Himself.
Yeah, it's an unquenchable thirst when you go down that path, right? When you try to, and this is in any situation, when you try to go down that path of being the arbiter of justice, and like you said, there's just going to be more and more things that you begin to see, and what's going to actually happen is you're going to start to look at everyone else and how injustices are happening in the world rather than in your own heart and your own soul. So you start to look outward and no longer do you look within and start to see the injustices that are actually within you, right? And that's the danger of what's going on right now, of this social justice movement, where we can look and point to everyone else, when what we really need to do is we need to sit in our room and we need to go, how am I a part of this? What are the injustices that I am myself doing? And not only in the world, but what injustices have I done to my Creator, right? And so, like you're saying, it's just an unquenchable thirst because I've been down that path of trying to right all the wrongs and go out and fix everything, and calling things out, and then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're like, man, I need to call some things out in here. I need to back up.
One of the biggest things that I've been learning and just observing in my own personal life and in my own world, but seeing through these events as well, is how quickly we all are to see and find the blame in others and point it out and want to condemn it and often rightly so, in some way hold it to account, but yet we don't see perhaps the exact same ways in which we're guilty of the same types of things. And so I find that to be true in this context. There's a lot of hypocrisy revealed in people's hearts, and the thing is, it's not that the initial desire and cry for justice or to see the problem. It's not that people are wrong in that at all. It's just that, hey, does that in any way exist in your own heart?
Yeah.
And when you realize it does, then you see, wow, we do have a justice problem, and who's going to hold me to account? And it causes you to be confronted with this ultimate justice that we're speaking of. And if nothing else, I mean, if you would if on that path you'd be driven to see your own need for mercy, then you will come to see God's gracious provision in giving His Son to satisfy justice truly for our own sins. But yet, at least along the way, as part of that process, or maybe apart from yet considering Christ, is just your own need for mercy, a humility. It ought to humble us and approach these issues with that humility a little more patiently and graciously, perhaps, even in the midst of strong emotions and righteous indignation.
Yeah. So because this video is titled One Race, right? One Race. So how do we find that unifying that unifying starting point that allows us to pull this thing back and allows us to go, okay, here's where we can find some common ground. Here's where we should be unified. And then if we branch out from there, at least we have this to always retreat back to be able to have that conversation. I find a lot of times in conversation, because we don't start with that common ground, we don't start with that unifying place, we don't really have anywhere to come back to be able to respect one another, to show grace and mercy and compassion to one another. So the first aim is to find that unifying place. And as we always talk about, that unifying place is found in the garden, right? It's found in the garden as God creates man and places him in the world in his image, in the imago Dei, to be his royal representatives, to take dominion over the earth, to subdue it and to keep it, and to take care of it, and to walk in fellowship with him and one another, right? And that's what we were commanded to do, to follow our King, to follow our Creator as he leads us and guides us in the way that we can, in the way that we should do life, in the way that leads us into the fullness of joy. And then what happens next is we decide to rebel against that.
Gets wrecked. But so as a Christian, at minimum here, Christians ought to be, I mean, if you call yourself a Christian or you acknowledge a Christian worldview, then this is your starting point. And much of humanity has some sort of or a more idealized kind of starting point, but we want to, like, what's a real principled foundation for this? Not just an idea of being unified and maybe seeing the commonalities among humanity and feeling like, oh, we're all in it together. But the Bible takes us to our beginning. Like, it's more principled and foundational.
Yeah.
Like, truly, we're saying this is how we started. Not this is what we think and what we long for, but this is how it is.
Yeah.
And God made every single human being, from the first humans come all humans that follow, and therefore we all are created. Every human being that has ever lived has been created in the image of God.
And we have a solid foundation to speak from there about all the things that are happening now, right? And so if you don't call yourself a Christian and you're crying out for social justice, you have to give me a reason why from your starting point, right? You can't just yell justice and then have no reason for justice. Like, justice doesn't just exist. There has to be a foundation for why justice should exist.
Yeah, there has to be a right and wrong.
What
is just and what is unjust?
Who
decides that?
That's right.
Where did that come from?
Why do we all acknowledge it? Like, so I said justice doesn't just exist, but it does exist. So and we all know it exists. So we have to drive back and go, well, where does that come from? What I mean by it doesn't just exist, it doesn't just pop up into existence
in a vacuum.
That's right.
The one who is just.
That's right. That's right.
From whom everything flows, and God's character is on display in our desire for justice, and as we carry out justice.
Yes.
And this is where you were getting. Justice is only needed in a world where there's injustice, where there's not justice,
right?
Where there's a law or a truth, and that's been broken, rebelled against, and fractured in some way.
And so we step into that part of the story where humanity is in the garden, dwelling with God, having fellowship with God the way that it was intended to be, having fellowship with one another, right? And then there's another character. There's another character that's involved in this whole story. It's not just God, Adam, and woman, right? There's another character, and we see that character very quickly in the story. And that character is cunning. That character is smart. He's witty. He knows how to come to us in a way that is deceptive, that is alluring, right? He comes to Adam and Eve, and he gets them to no longer focus on all the things that God has given them and to look at the one thing that God has restricted them from, and then he convinces them that God is a restrictive God, that you can't trust this God. No matter he's given you everything, you can't trust him because he's restricted you from one thing. And he leads them into this sin, this rebellion, and that sin and rebellion is missing the mark that God had made them for. It's missing the mark of being the royal representative following their king. Rather, they wanted to be king and go their own way and redefine covenantal reality, right? God had shaped covenantal reality with the covenant that he had made with Adam and what he had made with man and what he told them in Genesis 1 and 2. And then they rebel against it and they reshape it. And now we have a fallen world. Now they're escorted outside of the garden. And then immediately the next story in Genesis 4 is crimes against humanity, right? That's the next story that God tells.
I'd say it's the next story, tragically, graphically depicted, because it's carried out in this way where Cain kills Abel, brother kills brother. But before that, in the garden, when the deception occurs, what is happening, along at the center, I mean, the very nature of what transpired there in the fall is that the whole in God's design and his intention is to be in relationship with his people, and he creates the man, and it's not good that man be alone, so he creates the woman and out of the man, and they're intended though to be united as one, as the two are united as one with God the Father in relationship with him. So that in the serpent's crafty and deceptive words, he at the heart level, he induces the humans to disbelieve, to call into question the relationship. The unity that they ought have with their Creator, their Father God, as well as one another. And then, so that corruption takes place in the man and the woman, who become the mother and father of the humanity that follows, and you see in just their first generation.
And you see immediately after they take of the fruit and they rebel and they make the decision to go their own way instead of the way of God. You see this immediate hiding, right? They hide from God. They're ashamed. But then God comes on the scene, and Adam quickly, that woman that you gave me, God, he's like putting it in God's face, like, you did this. And then that woman, and he just, like, not 15 verses earlier was singing a poetic song over her. Like, oh, she's so beautiful. I love her. Like, we're one. It's wonderful. She's awful. She's terrible. So you see the relationship between God and man break. You see man to man, man to woman break, and then you see man to creation break. And that was that very good language in Genesis 1 and 2 was that harmony, and then sin, break. And then you see that brokenness follow through as the rest of the Bible is going to speak into the brokenness, right? George Floyd happened in Genesis 4, right? George Floyd is not the first crime against humanity, and he won't be the last, right? And that's why we're talking about this sense of justice. Like, it's not answered in fighting just over George Floyd. Like, they might have started protesting over Cain and Abel. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like, this has been happening from the beginning, and God exposes when you go your own way, when you rebel against me, and what I intend for my one race, humanity, my royal representatives, to go out together corporately. Humanity is not individualistic by nature. It's corporate. It's always been corporate. And the deceiver comes in and he goes, what color's your skin? They're different. What language are you speaking? They're different. What culture? They're different. Despise them. Hate them. Fight against them, right? And God goes, no, one race called to accomplish one purpose, my purpose. But when we reject God's purpose, then we all have to create our own individualistic purposes, which we all rally around. And God's like, that's not what humanity's about. It's about me. It's about what I'm up to, not what y'all are up to. You're all these lesser things that you people are after. Like, there's a greater story unfolding, and you're all unfolding your lesser stories. And it's causing you to fight one another rather than unify around who I am and who I've created you to be. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're just seeing all these lesser stories. Like, we're all longing for a greater story. That's the reality in all this, right? All these people that are going out and rioting, all these people that are peacefully protesting, we'll use those. I'm not going to talk about the rioters and the looters, but they're all wanting to be a part of this revolution, right? Like this revolution, this MLK revolution to take back, and they've bought into a certain narrative that we won't get into in this video, but we're going to talk to in later videos that we might disagree with. But what I want to talk about is the desire to pursue these kind of things. Like it's as if every generation, I mean, you go back to the 70s, right? They wanted to start a revolution. The one before them wanted to start a revolution. There's always this desire to start a revolution, to be a part of something greater than yourself. Because there is a greater story that we're a part of, and it's almost innately in us. Like we know it. We know there's something greater that we could be a part of. And the reality is that is true. And that story unfolds from the garden onward, and that's what we're caught up in. And because we reject that story, we take part in lesser stories. And when we do that, we all are starting our own lesser stories, and they usually conflict. And so then you have this conflict, and that's what the enemy wants. The enemy wants us to all take part in the lesser things where God is trying to give us a higher calling. And he's trying to say, your calling is so much higher than what you're dabbling in.
And so in that we see it. You know, humanity, it's built in ways. We have a conscience that testifies to the right and wrong, and that gives us that sense of justice, that longing for it. You know, we know when we've done right and wrong, and we see it in the world around us, and in so many other ways as well. That is the image of God in us, longing to come out, naturally desiring to exert itself. But yet, because we don't see this clearly, because we've fallen so far away from it, and the enemy's desire from the beginning, as we've said, has been to cloud our vision, to twist. It's not as if we don't see, but how we think about what we see and how we process it and interpret it. And we have done it since then through this more limited and inherently selfish vision, because like you're saying, it's not through God's eyes that we're seeing the whole, it's through our limited eyes that we're seeing our narrow scope of vision and just how it impacts me, and just that upon itself through generations. You know, we're blinded to this greater spiritual reality. So in a solution for these things must include an awakening, an ability to be able to see better, to see wider, a more expanded field of vision, and to understand reality as it truly is, because that's the way Satan, the enemy of all of humanity, who seeks to steal and kill and destroy, no matter what your color, no matter what part of the world you're from or language you speak. Satan is your enemy and hates you and wants to bring you down. So he deceives us into thinking, you know, these other things are going to be a solution, and is a master at taking something close to the truth and leading you down that path. And that's where we all, you know, we, in our desire to see justice, we get involved, and we go and we express our activism or get involved with this organization, and they're like, maybe noble attempts even, but again, without seeing that whole, without understanding that context of the Bible and how this all started, and what the ultimate solution is in Christ, and just returning to God, you know, we'll never, ever, ever, it is impossible to have the solution without properly understanding what the problem is.
Yes.
And so that's where we're coming from in this. That's our heart. And like, you know, I've observed in recent days, but, you know, beyond that too.
And the enemy wants to tell you a million other problems what it actually is, right? He doesn't want you to get back to the root. Yeah. Because that's where you get that clear vision. Right. And that's where unity can happen, because we can be unified around the real problem, right? Him. He's the real problem, right? And we can unify as the human race around the enemy that wants to steal, kill, and destroy all of our lives. Like we are unified under God against him.
That's the only root problem that we have in our sin, in the mix, for sure. But yet so that's the only thing that we can unify around. Because
Yes.
otherwise, we will all have our own, and we might unify with a big group of people, but we'll end up at odds with this other big group of people.
Yeah.
And so only in these most foundational principles and truths that the Bible teaches us can we be unified.
And his desire is to stay in the shadows, right? His desire is to lurk behind the shadows and constantly tell you that there's other things that you ought to unify around other than him, because he doesn't want that. And even in the story of Cain, I'm bringing this up because I love what God says to Cain. Cain goes and he offers faulty worship before God. He thinks he can go before God however he wants, right? We'll leave it at that. There's more to be said about that story, but we'll leave it at that because it's in the Cain story. But he decides to go before God whenever he wants to. Like, I just do what I want, God. His heart is in a terrible place to worship God. And God says, no. That's not how this works anymore. Like, you can't come to me whenever you want the way you were able to in the garden. You guys messed that up, right? That's not how this relationship works anymore. But what he says to Cain is so beautiful. He says to Cain, he says, if you do, he says, so Cain was very angry and his face fell. But the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door, and its desire is to have you, but you must rule over it. Right? And so God is telling Cain, he's like, look, sin, the enemy of your soul, the same way, because he knew the story of his mother and father, the same way that sin came to them, it comes to you, Cain. And its desire is to destroy your life. And you have to rule over it. You have to get a proper perspective of this, Cain. And you have to surrender it to me so that it doesn't destroy you. But what did Cain do? He totally rejected God's word. He totally rejected the proper perspective, and he went out with his own perspective. He went out to rule his own life, and it ended up leading him to kill his brother. To kill his brother, to commit a crime against humanity. And like you're saying, because we are not unifying around the real issue, which is sin and the enemy, it is causing us too to kill our brother. And we will continue to kill our brother until we do unify under the one race template that God has given us, the Genesis story, the Genesis starting point, because that is the starting point of reality. And that is the true problem in this entire scenario. And it's going to take a lot of backtracking. It's going to take a lot of reshaping our mind back to covenantal reality, the reality that God has shaped for us, because we no longer have a biblical starting point anymore. We no longer understand this. And as we move further and further and further away from that biblical starting point, which is what the enemy wants, right? He wants the Bible out of here because it is the correct starting point. And it does give you such a unreal perspective on what's going on. He wants that done away with. So we're operating in, and like we're all a bunch of people with amnesia. Like, we don't know anything. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know. And so we just start to individually side in different groups, and then these groups war against each other. And the enemy gets exactly what he wants, what he got with Cain and Abel, which is the murdering of the Imago Dei. The destruction of what God intended to be so glorious and so beautiful. What God intended to be the reflection of who he is on earth. We were made in God's image to reflect God to his creation, right? That's what an image does. It reflects. It reflects the glory of our Creator. And instead of reflecting it, now we're marred by sin. And now we murder our fellow brother. He comes to Cain and he says, Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? The irony in that is, yes, you are. I am my brother's keeper. And my brother is humanity. My brother is black. He's white. He's Hispanic. He speaks Spanish. He speaks German. That's my brother, right? I am my brother's keeper. And that's the absurdity in all this, that we don't see each other as brothers anymore.
When the deception too, it goes back to the way that we've been deceived. We're so confident in our misunderstandings about who we are, and to see the way that it's reinforced. I'd like to assert that the very notion of race is racist because we are not a different race. There is one race, humanity. And the differences that might exist genetically and in our appearance have come about just since the beginning, since the garden.
Since Noah.
And through different, means and processes and things that produce some real differences culturally,
Sure.
ethnically, and those kind of things are real, but actually at the core, genetically, the idea of race is like a Darwinian evolution idea that at its core considers certain races of humans to be more superior, inferior than the other. Yeah. And then we get indoctrinated in the education system, through the media and everywhere else, that this is just the fundamental reality. Well, built in to the fundamental reality that we're taught in our schools and our system is racism.
Yes.
And people like to point out the systemic racism in the system and the failures of the education system. And, those things can be talked about and they're there. But the most, if not the most crucial fundamental one, is this notion that we're different races. It's perpetuated in all these, self-righteous people around the world fighting for their good causes all have an inherently racist worldview. And they don't get it. And it's not to be necessarily, I'm angry at the injustice. I'm worked up at the injustice of that. And those are the kind of things we ought to be fired up about. And it, at the same time, unifies us to fight for the dignity and the oneness of who we truly are that can't be taken away. Yeah. You can't negate the truth of God and how He's created us and who He's created us to be.
Yeah, you just tempted me to go down a whole nother rabbit trail that I'm trying to pull back.
Yeah, I know. We're not going there today, but it's why we talk about those things. It's why we consider those things important.
It is, and the only reason I'm tempted is because I can see a high school professor right now that's out there, and he's like, he is a believer in Darwinian evolution by natural selection. And I'm just going to say one thing to that is that the high school professor that may be teaching it is not the same as the one who injected it into the system to begin with, right? You can thoroughly believe in something and wholeheartedly believe in it and it still not be true, while the people that injected in it have an entire different intention for the reasons why they inject it into the system, right? They don't believe in it at all. But their intention is exactly what you said. How can we, and their intention, let's go a step further, is given to them by the enemy of man's soul, which we're talking about, because his intention is divide at all cost. Divide this Imago Dei. Get them to fight amongst each other, because God forbid they ever unify around the one who is worthy and they see me for who I am. And then my game's up.
Right. When He wants nothing more to try and rob glory from God, which is impossible. Yeah. God's glory can't be diminished, but as God has intended for His glory to be on display in His people, and when we are at odds with one another, when the image of God is fighting itself, then Satan is getting his little thrill out of that.
And what better way to take the glory of God by telling His image bearers that He created and breathed life into that you're a fish, that you're chemical soup struck by lightning, that you're just an evolved fish, brother. Like there's no glory to you, right? Like, what better way? Like, that's a perfect strategy. And then we believe it, and we don't do our own research, and we listen to it from the top. And anyways, I'm not going to go there.
It's like they're out there. There's obviously this willingness to conceive of and believe some powerful forces, the powers that be, that are influencing our situations and manipulating us to control us and things. People are readily willing to accept that, except, again, the enemy just hijacks who that enemy actually is,
Right.
because he's trying to hide himself.
Yes. Yeah.
And,
And so so in this, like, as we start to wrap this one up, because I mean, this is, I think we got back to the unifier, and that's one race, right? The unifier is found in Genesis.
And who the enemy is,
and who
of
the
that
enemy
one
is.
race.
That's right. And who the enemy is of that one race.
Including the sin in our own heart.
Well, and that's what I was gonna say. Like, we have to get to a place where we're willing to sit down and we ask ourselves, why do we desire the things that we desire? Why do we pursue the things that we pursue? Like, not what our stated objective is, but what is our underlying objective in our own hearts that we maybe don't talk about, right? So the reason I say this is, like, if you think about in the garden, I've always thought about this, like, Adam and Eve were walking with God, right? They were walking with God. Like, why did they trust another entity, another being to come and deceive them? Like, what was it about them in the way that they were made that caused them to not listen to God, right? The one who had only been good to them, who had only, and as a father, you start to think about this stuff, right? Who had only done good to them and created this whole world and said, look, I'm going to give it to you. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to work. It's yours. It's yours. Go do this. Go take care of it. Go keep it. I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to teach you. Like, I'm a good dad. I'm a good father. Like, let's go. But there was something in the heart of man by being made in the image of God that desired to be God, that desired to take God's rightful place. And there was some element of glory about being made in the image of God that exists in the heart of man. And we need to recognize this about ourselves, because this is where the enemy tempts us, because it's where the enemy was tempted, right? He was a great cherubim. He was God's greatest creation. And he himself was tempted to take the throne of God. And God cast him down. Ezekiel, go read it. Ezekiel, Isaiah, it talks about it. He cast him down to the earth with 1/3 of his legion because he desired God's rightful place. And now and I know some people are going, man, it is a crazy story. Go check it out. We'll talk more about it later. But then then he allures us to go do exactly what he did. Like, you can't trust God. Like, you would be a better God. And he tempts that glory, right? He tempts that glory to dethrone God and take God's throne as if God could be dethroned, right? And so we act upon that. And we're still acting upon that. And that's the part, not just the sin that I want to I tell people to think about in their own heart, but how Satan tempts you. He tries to tempt that glory aspect about you, that desire to be known, right? I mean, look at social media today, right? Look at me. I need more followers. Like me. Comment on me, right? There's a desire within us to be known, to be elevated, right? To be famous, to have money so that I can be powerful over others, right? There's this glory about every individual human that exists within us because God made us that way, because we were supposed to be his royal representatives on earth. We were intended to be glorious, but it's been marred, right? But we're also created beings. And so we have this tendency to worship things. We have this tendency to follow movements, to worship fame and money and all these things around us. And we get caught up in these things because there's a worship element, because we're not the creator, we're the created. And anything that's created has a tendency to worship upward in some way, right? And so we need to identify that about us, because only the Genesis story tells us about these two divisions in our heart, this place of glory and this place of worship, and how if we don't have like you always say, if we don't have a correct starting place for those things, then we don't know where to terminate these things on things. So we don't know how to worship upwards, and we don't know how to reflect glory upwards. And if we go out, it's always going to be destructive. Always.
Yeah.
And that's how we're tempted.
Mm-hmm. And susceptible.
Yes, and
to
susceptible.
manipulation.
Yes, yes.
So again, we want to be able to see clearly. So, and in the process, and our great hope, the longing that we all have to see the world be a better place and to be just a more secure and peaceful place for us and our families, and just the most simple, basic desires that, again, God has placed in us. And we ought not even be caught up having to deal with all these problems in the world if it weren't for us, this fallen race of humans in the world at the source of all of our problems. And so the hope for that, the hope for redemption, the salvation, the rescue from this place is in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Amen.
It's God's salvation. The only one who can fix this problem is God himself, and he has done that. He has actually accomplished that work that's still being worked out, but the decisive work, the decisive battle has been done in Jesus. And what he does when we trust and put our faith in him is his life through his Spirit comes and dwells in his people who are born again, a new creation in Christ. They are a new humanity, and he's making our hearts new by his Spirit, conforming us to the image of Christ, returning us to the image of God that we were created in, submitted to God the Father, wanting, like Jesus, to only to do the desires of his Father, and willing to sacrifice, to lay our lives down in service to one another.
Yeah.
Because we love, no greater love is on display than the one who would lay his life down for his brothers. And Jesus said that, and Jesus did that. He demonstrated it for us. And
am I my brother's keeper?
Yes. Jesus says emphatically, yes, so much so that you die. Instead of kill your brother, you die for your brother. Woo!
Yeah,
so, that's our hope in this, and in whatever conversations and however we, whatever we might discuss, and however controversial it might be, however many hot buttons we might want to push, this is the heart, and this is the home base, and this is our desire, and just establishing this most basic premise for what we're doing are these truths, these foundational truths of the Bible. And, as we've said numerous times here today, this is the conviction that the solution can only be in dealing with these problems through this lens, from this perspective.
And it was difficult for Adam and Eve to receive all that God gave them because of the enemy. And it's difficult for you to receive Jesus and all that he wants to give you because of the enemy. You need to recognize that as we move forward, because you're bucking up to what we're about to do. This isn't our story. We didn't come up with this stuff. Like, we're not telling you our perspective. Like, there is an enemy that desires for you not to receive this story. Like, that's important. That's so important, because he wants you to reject this story, because you're going to constantly be just clouded. You're going to constantly be confused. You're going to constantly be lost. You're going to constantly be walking around like not understanding if you reject this story, because this story is the only story that can define reality, because it is reality.
So with that being said, is it cool if I pray real quick?
Absolutely.
All right. Father, I just pray because you are almighty and powerful. Jesus, you reign supreme right now. Yes, you are enthroned in heaven, and you are Lord of this earth. And God, you speak light into darkness. And so we just pray, Jesus, that you would send your light into this world. Yes, remove the veil from our eyes. Help us see. Unshackle our heart, Lord. Make it a heart of flesh. Let it beat for you. Let us let these truths resonate in our hearts as much as it's true, God. And your truth, let our hearts come alive with it to receive and become the people that you would have us be, to fight the good fight of faith. And that may mean laying our lives down in sacrifice, but it also, that could be fighting this battle for ideas and standing on the truth. And God, but in order to see that and respond appropriately, we need spiritual eyes. We need to be able to discern. So we pray that we ourselves and all people might have those spiritual eyes, have the ability to hear, and God, speak to us. We pray in this time that you would come into this world and work through your people and work through those desiring truth and justice and righteousness and establish that in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.